My name is Kidron Cannon, and first and foremost, I am an MMA fan. I watch it all the time. I actually film MMA as one of the main things I do for a living. That's definitely the thing I enjoy filming the most. So, that being said, I'm constantly surrounded by MMA, seeing MMA, editing MMA, or just watching MMA. And I know there's plenty of outlets out there for MMA where you can watch it, where you can read about it, where you can see all the stats. But the one thing I noticed that there wasn't available was a place that would review MMA. Now, in the film world, of course, there's Rotten Tomatoes, there's all kinds of different sources that review movies when they come out and will let you know what's good, what's bad, but movies aren't live. MMA is. It's something you tune in live to watch. So it's a little bit different to review, but I wanted to try and give it a shot and give my best attempt of reviewing MMA. So I decided to start this channel, the MMA Review. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all those things. And right now, of course, you're watching us from YouTube. This is what we're going to do each week. We're going to review, looking back at the past weekend, the fights that just took place, what went down, how it was, the winners, the losers, the good, the bad, the ugly. We're not just pulling these numbers or these thoughts out of thin air. We've developed a system, a whole ranking system of measurements that we're going to use to assess the different attributes of the fight card, how the fights went, how exciting they were, how energetic, how many finishes, all those types of things are going to be taken into consideration. And one of the main things we need is for all of you out there to weigh in. And the way you can do that, follow us on Instagram at the MMA Review. Where after every fight card, we're going to put up a poll. Get your thoughts, thumbs up, thumbs down. How'd you feel about that? And that's going to factor into our review. Same thing on Twitter, same thing on Facebook. So go follow those pages. We really want your input, and we don't want our opinion to be the only opinion out there that's being heard. We want as much input as we can get from everyone in the MMA community. Now, in most episodes, I'm going to be joined by a guest, usually an MMA expert, either a promoter, a fighter, a manager, someone who's very involved in the MMA community and can weigh in, give their input and their review of the post-weekend's fights, as well as weigh in and give their thoughts on what's going to be coming up the next weekend on the next card. And we're going to give you our picks on each fight, who we think might win, so you can follow along with us with the UFC Fantasy app, make your own picks. All right, enough of that. Let's get into the fun stuff. Let's start talking about some MMA. So this last weekend was the very first time that UFC has gone to Belem, Brazil, which of course is the hometown of Lyoto Machida, who, coincidentally, was the headliner of that event. So as most fight cards do when they're in Brazil, it started off with a lot of energy. Right out of the gate before the first punch was thrown, the crowd was already chanting the famous Brazilian chant, "You're gonna die," or however you want to translate that, directed at the opponents, the non-Brazilian fighters. There were 11 fights, 11 Brazilians, one in each fight. No Brazilians fought each other. Overall, the Brazilians did very well for themselves, only dropping 2 of the 11 fights. So going into the first fight, there was a lot of energy. Davison Figueiredo taking on Joseph Morales. Went to the second round. It was a really, really good, exciting fight. A lot of times I thought it might stop, there might be a finish, but it ended up taking Davison Figueiredo just into the second round, about 4 minutes in, towards the end of the second round, to get the TKO victory. It was a great fight. The energy was great in the arena. The second fight, going on to Fox Sports 2, Yuri Alcantara taking on Joe Soto. Again, another fight going to a TKO. This time it was a lot quicker, just 1 minute in. Yuri Alcantara got the finish, TKO. Joe Soto, I was actually surprised. He's one of those guys who typically they have a good showing. They're pretty hard to put away, but took Alcantara just over a minute to do that. And the next fight was more of the same. Poliana Viana, I believe making her UFC debut, could be wrong on that, taking on Maya Stevenson, the wife of Joe Daddy Stevenson, putting her away in just 3 minutes with a rear naked choke. So all 3 of the first fights, finishes pretty quick right out of the gate. But then going into the fourth fight of the night, Alan Patrick, as it looks like on paper, but it's Alan Patrick. He's a Brazilian, taking on Damir Hadzovic. And this was the first decision of the night. And, well, sometimes with decisions, the energy can just kind of fall. It can kind of be drug out. But this was actually a really good competitive fight. Went the distance. Alan Patrick getting the win there. Another win for the Brazilians. But it was a really good, entertaining fight overall. And then the final fight on the Fox Sports 2 undercard being Sergio Moraes and Tim Means. Again, another really entertaining decision. That was a split decision. And the momentum actually maintained itself. The energy was still good in the crowd throughout both of these decision victories. And that brings us to the main card, which actually took off with a bang. The momentum really stayed all the way up to this point. The first fight on the main card being Thiago Santos versus Anthony Smith. And I believe this won fight of the night. It was a really just entertaining, it won fight of the night. It was a really entertaining battle. It actually only went into the second round, just barely into the second round, about a minute in. But just right out of the gate, the energy, it was just crazy. It was a really competitive back and forth fight. Well, not that back and forth, but it was a really good fight. Thiago Santos just doing work. He ended up getting Anthony Smith the body kick. So another great matchup. There were a lot of really good matchups in this fight card. And that brings us to, we went into 3 back-to-back decisions at this point. Douglas Silva de Andrade, another Brazilian, getting the win over Marlon Vera. This went to a decision. This was another really good competitive back-and-forth decision fight. It was very exciting all the way to the end. The momentum and the energy in the crowd was still there. But anytime there's a decision, the crowd at some point is just kind of, the momentum's going to get slowed down at some point, which unfortunately led into Timothy Johnson and Marcelo Gollum. I actually had a lot of hope for this one for Gollum. He's a young guy, I believe 8-0 going into this fight. He doesn't have a ton of fights under his belt, but taking on Timothy Johnson, who's an older, they're both heavyweights, Timothy Johnson being the much bigger guy. But going into this one, always at heavyweight, the fans are hoping for, I admit I'm hoping for a great, crazy knockout at heavyweight. It tends to happen. But when it doesn't, it can sometimes turn into a drawn out decision, guys getting gassed out. And that's actually kind of what happened in this fight. Timothy Johnson did what he needed to do, held Marcelo Gollum against the fence for the majority of the 3 rounds. Gollum got away a few times, but every time Timothy Johnson just got him right back up against the fence. Kind of drug it out a little bit. Ended up being a unanimous decision for Timothy Johnson, but the Brazilian fans obviously not into that one, and momentum kind of died down a little bit there. Next fight, Michel Prazeres and Desmond Green also went to a decision. Energy was up and down on this one. The crowd got into it a good bit. Now, Michel Prazeres missed weight. It had to be at catchweight, 161. It was supposed to be 155, so he had to give up a good bit of his purse, his win, to Desmond Green because he missed weight so badly. And it was really evident, unfortunately. Desmond Green's a great wrestler, but that added weight and the wrestling, grappling of Michel Prazeres was just too much for him to overcome. So Green got beaten that decision. Michel Prazeres, the Brazilian, getting the win. So the fans were into it. They enjoyed it. But it was a little bit slow, a little bit drawn out. Still a pretty good competitive fight. Desmond Green did as well as you could expect in a hostile territory against a guy who missed weight, who was already just a much bigger guy with the crowd behind him. So good job by Desmond Green there, staying in to the end on that one. A couple times it could have gotten stopped. Co-main event, Valentina Shevchenko and Priscilla Cachoeira, I think is how they say her name, Cachoeira being the Brazilian there. And Valentina, obviously the former title contender, up at 135, dropping down, making 125 easily, and taking on the newcomer, Priscilla Cachoeira. I believe she had 8 fights coming into this one. And I looked into her opponent's records on that, and none of them were very experienced, all pretty much in Brazil, local circuit, no one to really bring in that high-level experience that you get in the UFC. And it was really evident, and unfortunately, it was just an ugly fight. Right out of the gate, Shevchenko got her with I believe it was just a cross that just kind of staggered her, stood her up. Her feet were a little uneven at that point. And from there, Shevchenko just did work, standing, really hurt her, took her straight to the ground, which still surprises me, watching, a high pedigree striker taking people down and submitting people in recent fights. But that just shows you the development of the game and how Shevchenko is just developing. Got her to the ground, and man, it was rough. Could have gotten stopped in the first, went to the second round, could have gotten stopped many times in the second, and I believe from what I heard, I couldn't see it watching from the camera angles that I could see, but I was told that Cachoeira tapped out a couple times. The referee, Mario Yamasaki, not seeing that and not stopping the fight. So she took some unnecessary damage against Valentina Shevchenko, who's obviously a very dominant former title challenger. And just not a great moment. It was really kind of awkward, upsetting to a lot of the people there. And generally, obviously, if it had been the other way around, the Brazilian putting the beat down, the crowd would have been going crazy. But as it was, their newcomer, the local girl, getting beaten down in that way, the audience, yeah, you could just tell it was kind of an awkward vibe. That brings us to the main event, which was actually a pretty great fight. I have to admit, I'm a huge Lyoto Machida fan. I've been a fan for years, from back in the day when he was knocking out Rashad Evans, taking the title at 205. I just loved his karate jumping in counter style, and how he could just catch people off guard. Then, after being knocked out by Shogun, being knocked out multiple times, dropping a middleweight, being knocked out, and just getting beaten down in a lot of fights, when someone gets to that age later in their 30s and they've been beaten down like that, you just kind of expect when they fight a younger, strong, athletic guy that there's a good chance they're going to get knocked out. And Eric Anders in his UFC debut obviously knocked out Rafael Natal, who was kind of in that same era as Machida, and knocked him out easily in the first round. So I kind of expected the same thing against Machida, unfortunately, but fortunately that didn't happen. Anders did, stand him up with a good, I think it was a right straight, in that first round, countered one of the leg kicks. It might have been the second round, but that was the only time I really felt like Machida was really hurt. But he recovered really well. He played the distance. He kept his distance. He was good at counter striking. He landed quite a few good counters. Made Anders miss a lot. There was quite a few times Anders was swinging kind of wildly and missing. So good learning experience for Anders. Anders ended up losing the split decision. I gave it to him on my scorecards 3-2, but I'm not a judge, and the judges a lot of times shouldn't be judges either, because they're boxing judges, and what do they know about MMA? And yeah, that's a big problem in the sport. But nonetheless, Lyoto got the nod. Hometown kid from Belem, Brazil, got the win in Belem for the first time the UFC was there. Great fight, really competitive. Could have gone either way, like I said, but Lyoto's hanging in there. He's still doing good work at middleweight, getting later on in his career, obviously wants to make another title run. We'll see if it can happen. But anyway, that middleweight division, just very competitive. I have to give a shout out to Eric Anders as well. The MMA organization that I filmed for before Eric was in the UFC used to fight for this organization that I work with. It's called V3 Fights. They're based in Memphis, Tennessee. Great promotion in the South. And Eric Anders fought, I believe, 5 times for V3, and I believe he won all 5. So really cool to have a guy who came from the local scene that I'm kind of working with and filming with, and in very short time, year and a half, going into the UFC, working his way up to a main event spot against a former title holder at 205, Lyoto Machida. Just really cool to see. And obviously cool to see Lyoto get the nod as well. So it was a good moment there that Lyoto won, not decisively, but through all of that, really the crowd up and down throughout that fight, on the edge of their seats, not sure if Lyoto was going to get knocked out or what was going to happen, but stayed with it, and he won, and they roared, and he got his hand raised at the end. And so yeah, overall, I would say there were a lot of really evenly matched fights. A bunch of variety of entertaining finishes, submissions, TKOs, and so it was overall a really great event. But a few times the event was kind of stagnated by a couple of things. One, going into early on the preliminary card on Fox Sports 2, a couple fights got over early, and so the UFC has to stretch out the content to fill a 2-hour block with those 4 fights. So if 2 get over early, they had to just kind of wait a while before the third fight. And when they do this, there's kind of a lot of people waiting around, the crowd waiting around, and it loses a lot of energy at that point. That was kind of it's unavoidable with the structure the UFC has with their TV deal, but it's kind of it can be annoying to the fans watching when that happens because it loses the momentum. You know, you want your guy just won, you want the next one to come out and get started and just keep that momentum going, but unfortunately didn't happen that way. Another couple things which are inevitable, they're going to happen, but a couple fights just kind of going the distance. Obviously going to a decision is going to happen, but when that does happen, you want it to be an exciting fight throughout. You know, when guys are getting gassed out, especially heavyweights, and it just kind of drags on, they're waiting for the clock to run out, the momentum can die, the fans can lose interest. Booing, obviously, I mean, it doesn't take much for fans to boo, especially when they get drunk, but you know, fights like that, when they happen, just kind of bring down the overall vibe of the event. And so just those couple of things prevented the show from being an amazing show. It was a good show, and it almost fully lived up to the potential of what it could have been. And overall, it was a pretty solid event. So that's my review of UFC Belem from last weekend. And now let's get into the preview of UFC 221 coming up this weekend. Of course, being headlined by middleweights, staying on the same topic, Romero and Rockhold.